Officer Miller smirked as 17-year-old Maya Washington claimed her mother was a Green Beret. Blood trickled down Maya's handcuffed wrists as mall security cameras recorded everything. Then the glass doors slid open and a woman in civilian clothes entered. The polished marble floors of the Northgate Galleria reflected the afternoon sun in blinding fractals, a stark contrast to the infinite, velvet darkness that usually occupied Maya Washington's thoughts. At 17, she navigated the world with the quiet, methodical precision of an astronomer charting a new nebula. Her destination today was Stargazer's Gear, an enclave of celestial ambition tucked between a designer shoe boutique and a store that sold $1,000 handbags. Dressed in a simple gray hoodie with the words "The future is interstellar" printed across the chest, she was on a mission. The final components for her custom-built telescope tracker, a device that would allow her Dobsonian to follow the slow, majestic dance of deep sky objects, were within reach. Inside, the air was cool and hushed, smelling faintly of ozone and cleaning solution. Telescopes stood like silent, silver sentinels, their lenses aimed at a distant, imagined cosmos. Maya moved with purpose, her detailed project schematics and a carefully curated shopping list clutched in her hand. She needed a specific stepper motor, a set of high-torque gears, and a microcontroller she couldn't find anywhere else. As she examined a display of eyepieces, comparing focal lengths, she was oblivious to the shadow that had begun to fall over her. The store clerk, a man in his late 50s with a neatly trimmed beard and a weary expression, had been watching her since she entered. He saw not a budding astrophysicist, but a stereotype. He straightened a display she hadn't touched, his movements a little too deliberate. "Can I help you find something?" he asked, his tone implying she might be lost. "I'm good. Thanks," Maya replied politely, pointing to her list. Just grabbing a few things for a project. She found the motor and was comparing two different microcontrollers when the calm of the store was shattered by a piercing shriek. "My bag. It's gone." A woman, impeccably dressed in a cream-colored pantsuit, was frantically patting down the pockets of her blazer. This was Susan Miller. Her blonde hair was perfectly coiffed, her makeup flawless, but her face was a mask of theatrical panic. "My purse. My brand new, limited edition Valeni. It was right here." The clerk rushed to her side, his expression shifting from weary suspicion to solicitous concern. "Ma'am, what happened?" Susan's frantic gaze swept the store, her eyes widening as they landed on Maya. It was a calculated, predatory lock. Her perfectly manicured finger shot out, trembling with manufactured outrage. She did it. She was lurking right behind me." The accusation, sharp and venomous, hung in the air. Maya froze, the microcontroller still in her hand. A cold knot of disbelief tightened in her stomach. "What? No, But her voice was drowned out. The clerk, without a moment of hesitation, took Susan's side. He placed himself between the accuser and the accused, a self-appointed guardian of privilege. "Ma'am, don't worry, we'll handle this." He gave Maya a look of profound disappointment, as if she had personally betrayed his trust. Two mall security guards materialized with an alarming swiftness that suggested they were always waiting for such a call. They were large men, their uniforms stretched taut over muscular frames. One, with a shaved head and a thick neck, grabbed Maya's right arm. The other, younger with a nervous energy, seized her left. Their grips were painfully tight. "There's been a mistake," Maya said, her voice shaking but clear. The principles of physics she so admired, logic, evidence, proof, seemed to have evaporated from this small corner of the universe. "I didn't take anything. You check my backpack. I have my project plans right here." They ignored her. It was as if she were speaking a language they couldn't or wouldn't understand. The guard with the shaved head spoke into his radio, his voice flat and bored. "Got a 10 to 36 in progress at Stargazers. Teenage female, possible theft. Bringing her to the office." The walk to the security office was a blur of shame. Faces turned to stare, curious shoppers, families with young children, teenagers her own age. Each glance felt like a physical blow. She could feel their judgment, their easy acceptance of the narrative being presented. A young black girl in a hoodie, a wealthy white woman in a pantsuit. The equation was simple, and in their eyes, already solved. The security office was a small, windowless room that smelled of stale coffee and disinfectant. Maya was pushed into a hard plastic chair. Susan Miller was ushered to a more comfortable one, where she continued her performance, dabbing at her dry eyes with a tissue. The store clerk stood by, arms crossed, looking self-satisfied. Maya tried again, her voice low but steady. "I'm a student at Northwood High. I'm here for my astrophysics project. I can call my teacher. I can show you my work. I didn't steal anything." Her words were met with an impenetrable wall of disbelief. They had already tried and convicted her in their minds. The evidence was her skin, her clothes, her presence in a place they felt she didn't belong. As she sat there, the cold reality of her situation began to set in, a chilling eclipse of the bright, orderly world she was used to. The universe she loved was governed by laws, by beautiful, immutable truths. But here on Earth, she was learning, the laws were far more arbitrary and cruel. The door to the security office swung open, and Officer Miller walked in. He was a man who seemed molded from cynicism and lukewarm coffee. His uniform was crisply pressed, but his eyes were weary, carrying the weight of 1,000 preconceived notions. He moved with a casual authority, his hand resting on the butt of his holstered pistol as he surveyed the scene. He didn't look at Maya directly, instead addressing the security guard. "So what's the story?" "This lady," the guard said, gesturing towards Susan, says the girl lifted her designer bag. "Worth about $2,500. Miller finally turned his gaze on Maya, a flicker of something between boredom and contempt in his eyes. "All right, let's hear it. What's your side?" The question was a formality, his tone already dismissing whatever she might say. "Sir, I didn't take her bag," Maya said, keeping her voice as level as she could manage. "I was buying components for a science project. My backpack has my school ID, my project notes, and the money I was going to use. You can check everything." Yeah, a science project," Miller sighed, as if he'd heard this particular lie 1,000 times. "Empty your backpack. On the table. Now." Maya carefully slid her backpack off her shoulders and began to place the contents on the metal table. Her meticulously organized notebooks, a binder filled with complex equations, her wallet, and the small pouch of cash she'd saved for months. Miller showed no interest in her academic materials. He roughly upended the bag, spilling the remaining items. A protractor, a scientific calculator, and a worn copy of Carl Sagan's Cosmos skittered across the surface. He found no purse. His eyes narrowed, the lack of evidence seeming only to confirm his suspicion. "Okay, where do you stash it? Give it to an accomplice?" "I don't have an accomplice," Maya insisted, her frustration mounting. "I didn't take it because it was never stolen. You should be checking the security cameras, not interrogating me." Susan Miller let out a derisive snort. "She's good, isn't she? So calm. They always are. They practice this." The casual racism of her comment, the insidious that hung in the sterile air. Officer Miller nodded slowly, a silent affirmation of Susan's prejudice. He seemed to have reached the end of his perfunctory investigation. Without another word, he pulled out a pair of steel handcuffs. "Until we find the bag, you're being detained on suspicion of grand larceny," he stated flatly. The cold metal clamped around Maya's wrists. A jolt of icy panic shot through her. This couldn't be happening. He cinched them tight, far tighter than necessary. The serrated edges dug into her skin. She winced a sharp, biting pain. "They're too tight," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "You're hurting me." Miller ignored her, giving the cuffs a final, demonstrative tug. Tiny beads of blood began to well up where the steel bit into her flesh, starkly red against her brown skin. The room was silent, the other occupants watching with a placid indifference that was somehow more chilling than open hostility. A straight-A student, a girl who dreamed of charting distant galaxies, was being treated like a hardened criminal, and no one batted an eye. Drawing on a reservoir of strength she didn't know she possessed, Maya centered herself. She remembered her mother's words, drilled into her since she was a little girl, a painful but necessary curriculum for navigating a world that would not always be kind. Stay calm. Know your rights. Never let them see you break. "I'd like to make my phone call now," she said, her voice regaining its firmness. "That is my right." Officer Miller raised a skeptical eyebrow. "Oh, it's your right, is it? Calling your lawyer? The getaway driver." He chuckled at his own joke. "Who are you going to call, your mommy?" The sarcasm was thick, designed to belittle and unnerve her. But Maya met his condescending gaze without flinching. "Yes," she said clearly. "I'm going to call my mother." "And who's she?" Miller sneered, leaning in closer. "Someone important? The mayor, maybe?" Maya held his gaze, her expression unreadable. She let the silence stretch for a beat, drawing power from it. Then she delivered the words, each one precise and deliberate. "My mother is Sergeant Major Evelyn Washington," she said. "She's a Green Beret in the United States Army." The statement landed in the room and detonated. Not with a bang, but with a wave of derisive laughter. It started with Officer Miller, a loud, barking laugh that filled the small space. The security guards joined in, their shoulders shaking. Even Susan Miller managed a smug, condescending smirk. "A Green Beret? Oh, that's a new one," Miller wheezed, wiping a tear of mirth from his eye. "Kid, let me give you some advice. If you're going to lie, at least make it believable. People like you, your stories are always so dramatic." The phrase "people like you" was a deliberate poison dart. He unlocked her phone and held it out to her, his face still alight with mockery. "Go on then. Make the call. I can't wait to talk to this Sergeant Major." With as much dignity as she could muster, her wrists bleeding and her spirit bruised, Maya recited her mother's number. As the phone began to ring, a flicker of something hard and unyielding crossed her face. They thought this was a joke. They thought they had broken her. They had no idea what was coming. Sergeant Major Evelyn Washington moved through the world with a purpose that bordered on a force of nature. Even in the sterile, fluorescent-lit corridors of Fort Bragg's command center, she radiated an aura of contained energy, of immense capability held in reserve. Her uniform was immaculate, her posture a testament to 20 years of discipline, but it was her eyes that truly commanded attention. They were the eyes of a strategist, someone who could assess a complex situation in seconds, identify weaknesses, and formulate a plan of attack. She was in the middle of a high-level briefing on counterterrorism logistics when her personal cell phone vibrated with a unique, insistent pattern she had assigned to only one person, her daughter. Protocol dictated that the phone remain off during such meetings. But instinct, honed on battlefields both foreign and domestic, screamed at her to answer. She saw Maya's name on the screen and a cold dread, more potent than any fear she'd felt under fire, washed over her. Maya never called during school hours. "Generals, excuse me," she said, her voice calm but non-negotiable. "I have to take this." The room of high-ranking officers nodded without question. They knew Sergeant Major Washington. If she said it was an emergency, it was. She stepped into a soundproof anteroom. "Maya, what's wrong?" "Mom." The single word was freighted with a tension only a mother could decipher. It was controlled, too controlled. "I'm at the Northgate Galleria, in the security office. They're accusing me of stealing a purse. I'm in handcuffs." Evelyn's mind processed the information with tactical speed. Location, situation, status of friendly. "Are you hurt?" she asked, her voice sharp. "The cuffs are too tight. My wrists are bleeding." "Mom, they're laughing at me. I told them who you were, and they laughed." In that moment, a switch flipped inside Evelyn. The calm, strategic commander receded, and a colder, more primal force took its place. It was the focused rage of a mother whose child was in danger. It was the fury of a soldier who had fought for a country that was now failing her own daughter in the most fundamental way. "I'm on my way," she said, her voice dropping to a low, dangerous pitch. 30 minutes. Do not say another word to them. Do you understand me, Maya?" "Nothing." She ended the call and strode back into the briefing room. "My daughter is being illegally detained by civilian authorities. I am taking emergency leave, effective immediately." Without waiting for a reply, she was gone. Her first call was to her commanding officer, a man who had seen her lead a team through a 3-day firefight in the mountains of Afghanistan. "Sir, I need a quiet support team at Northgate Galleria. Legal and medical. Unmarked vehicle. My daughter's been wrongfully detained. Whatever you need, Ev," the general replied without hesitation. "Go handle your business." Her next call was to Captain Davis of the JAG Corps. "Davis, I need you at Northgate. Civilian clothes for now. Bring the full kit. We have a potential civil rights violation involving a minor and a military dependent." Her final call was to Master Sergeant Chun, a seasoned MP with a reputation for being unshakable. "Chun, I need you and a medic. Northgate Galleria Security Office. Assess and report. My daughter has sustained injuries during detainment." 28 minutes later, Evelyn's unremarkable sedan pulled into a parking spot with a clear view of the mall entrance. She had changed into a simple black t-shirt and jeans, deliberately stripping herself of any overt signs of authority. She wanted to walk in as a mother. She wanted them to see her as they saw her daughter. She wanted to measure the full depth of their prejudice before she corrected it. Taking a deep, centering breath, she got out of the car. Her walk was unhurried, but each step was precise, eating up the ground with an efficiency that was second nature. As she passed through the automatic glass doors, the mall's ambient chaos seemed to part for her. She was a stone dropping into a pond, a point of focused gravity in a world of random motion. She found the security office and pushed the door open without knocking. The scene was exactly as she had pictured it. Maya in a chair, her face pale but defiant, blood on her wrists. Officer Miller looming over her with an air of smug satisfaction. The accuser, Susan, looking bored. The guards, looking stupid. Evelyn's eyes met Maya's, a silent exchange of strength and reassurance passing between them. Then, her gaze settled on Officer Miller. "I'm Evelyn Washington, Maya's mother," she said. Her voice was quiet, yet it cut through the room's stale air like a razor. "I want those handcuffs removed from my daughter. Now." Miller barely glanced at her. He saw a black woman in a t-shirt and assumed he knew exactly who he was dealing with. "Ma'am, your daughter's part of an investigation. The cuffs stay on until I say so." Evelyn took a slow step forward. "Officer, according to Section 4, Paragraph 2 of your own department's field manual, the use of restraints on a nonviolent minor for a nonviolent offense requires demonstrable evidence of flight risk, which you do not have. Furthermore, any restraint causing visible injury constitutes excessive force. You are currently in violation of at least 2 departmental regulations." Miller stared at her, his smug expression faltering for the first time. "And how would you know that?" Evelyn didn't answer. Instead, she reached into her back pocket, pulled out her wallet, and retrieved her military ID. She didn't flash it. She placed it deliberately on the metal table, face up. "Sergeant Major Evelyn Washington, United States Army Special Forces," she stated, her voice still quiet but now carrying the weight of the United States government. "Now, for the last time, take the handcuffs off my daughter before the situation escalates into a federal matter." The temperature in the room plummeted. Miller's face went slack as he stared at the ID card, the rank, the eagle, the words Special Forces. The power dynamic in the room had not just shifted. It had been completely and irrevocably inverted. The laughter had stopped. The game was over. The silence that descended upon the security office was heavy and absolute. Officer Miller's bravado evaporated, replaced by a pallid, clammy uncertainty. He looked from a military ID on the table to Evelyn's unyielding face, and for the first time, a flicker of genuine fear entered his eyes. He fumbled for the key and unlocked Maya's handcuffs. The raw, red welts on her wrists were a damning indictment. Evelyn didn't rush to her daughter's side. Not yet. Her mission was not complete. She remained focused on the objective. "The security footage," she said, her voice a flat command, not a request. "I want to see the complete, unedited recordings from Stargazer's gear for the last hour." The mall's head of security, a nervous, overweight man named Henderson who had been hovering in the background, suddenly became very eager to assist. "Of course, ma'am. Right away." His sudden deference was almost comical. He had received a text message moments before Evelyn's arrival. A simple, two-word directive from the mall's corporate headquarters: cooperate fully. He didn't know who had made the call, but he knew it was from a level of authority far above his own. He brought the footage up on a large monitor. Evelyn stood before it, her posture unwavering. She was no longer just a mother. She was an intelligence analyst dissecting enemy movements. Start from when my daughter entered the store. Play it at normal speed. The footage rolled. It showed Maya browsing, list in hand, her movements purposeful and efficient. It showed the clerk following her, his suspicion palpable even on the grainy screen. Then, it showed Susan Miller entering the store. Stop, Evelyn commanded. Zoom in on Mrs. Miller. Go back 30 seconds. Henderson complied. The enlarged image showed Susan standing near the entrance, momentarily obscured by a large display. She adjusted her pantsuit, and for a split second, the camera caught a clear view of her side. She was not carrying the designer handbag she would later claim was stolen. Continue, Evelyn said, her voice cold. The footage played on. It showed Susan wandering the store, her path seeming aimless. Then, as she passed near Maya, she let out her theatrical shriek. Now, Evelyn said, turning her attention from the screen to the increasingly pale accuser. Let's see the footage from the main concourse, camera 7, time-stamped 5 minutes before Mrs. Miller entered Stargazer's gear. Henderson's fingers flew across the keyboard. A new angle appeared on the screen, showing a coffee shop directly opposite the telescope store. There, sitting at an outdoor table, was Susan Miller. She was talking to a man in a baseball cap. As their conversation ended, she stood up. The camera clearly captured her handing her expensive, limited edition Valeni handbag to the man, who then slipped it into a larger, nondescript duffel bag and walked away in the opposite direction. A collective gasp went through the room. It wasn't a misunderstanding. It wasn't a mistake. It was a deliberate, calculated act. This wasn't a theft, Evelyn stated, her voice ringing with the authority of absolute certainty. She turned to face the stunned occupants of the room. This was a setup, a premeditated conspiracy to falsely accuse a minor. She walked over to the table and picked up her ID. Officer Miller, you detained my daughter without a shred of evidence. You ignored her repeated requests to view this footage, which would have exonerated her immediately. You physically injured her through the improper application of restraints. You and your department are now accessories to a felony. Susan Miller, her face ashen, finally broke her silence. This is ridiculous. It's a mistake. That man, he was just an acquaintance. I must have left my bag with him by accident. Evelyn's gaze was withering. An accident? The footage shows you glancing around, making sure no one was watching before you handed it over. It shows you specifically choosing to walk into a store where a young black woman was shopping alone. You didn't lose your bag, Mrs. Miller. You weaponized it. Before anyone could respond, the door opened again. A tall, impeccably dressed African-American man in a U.S. Army captain's uniform entered, followed by a stoic Asian-American man in the uniform of a master sergeant of the military police. Captain Davis, JAG Corps, the first man said with a crisp nod. Master Sergeant Shun, MP Sergeant Major, we're here to provide legal and logistical support. Captain Davis surveyed the room, his eyes lingering for a moment on Maya's injured wrists. His professional demeanor hardened. He turned to Officer Miller. Officer, I trust you have preserved all records of this interaction, including your body camera footage and all communications regarding this detainment. Miller, who was sweating profusely, stammered, My body cam, it was malfunctioning. Master Sergeant Shun, who had been silent until now, spoke up, his voice calm and steady. That's interesting, officer, because Mall Security Camera 12, located in the main concourse, shows you deactivating your body camera manually just before you entered this office. The trap had been sprung. The lie was not just unmasked. It was systematically and ruthlessly dismantled piece by piece with the cold, undeniable logic of video evidence. The hunters had become the hunted. The arrival of Captain Davis and Master Sergeant Shun fundamentally altered the composition of the room. It was no longer a civilian matter being handled by a local cop. The full, formidable weight of the United States military's legal and enforcement apparatus had just walked through the door, and the air crackled with a new, institutional gravity. Captain Davis, his JAG Corps insignia gleaming under the fluorescent lights, was the picture of professional calm. He placed a slim leather briefcase on the table and opened it with practiced efficiency. Sergeant Major Washington is a decorated member of the U.S. Army Special Forces. He began, his voice measured but firm, addressing everyone in the room, but directed squarely at Officer Miller. Her daughter, Maya Washington, is a military dependent. As such, any crime committed against her, particularly one motivated by racial bias, falls under the purview of several federal statutes, including the Military Extraterritorial Jurisdiction Act and specific provisions of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. He pulled out a file. We have reason to believe this incident was not merely a false accusation, but a targeted act constituting a hate crime. The deliberate selection of a minority teenager, the immediate escalation without investigation, and the use of excessive force all point to a pattern of discriminatory intent. Officer Miller, now looking cornered and desperate, found his voice. This is a local police matter. You have no jurisdiction here. On the contrary, Officer, Captain Davis countered smoothly. When the civil rights of a service member's family are violated, potentially impacting that service member's readiness and morale, it becomes a matter of national security. We absolutely have jurisdiction. Just then, a portly man in a cheap suit bustled into the room, flashing a badge. Frank Rizzo, police union representative, he announced, puffing out his chest. I'm here to represent Officer Miller. My client was following standard procedure based on a credible witness report. Captain Davis gave the union rep a thin, humorless smile. Mr. Rizzo, your client's standard procedure involved injuring a minor, ignoring exculpatory evidence, and deactivating his body camera. His credible witness has just been recorded on video perpetrating a felony. I would strongly advise your client to remain silent until he has retained a criminal defense attorney, as he is now the subject of a federal investigation. The union rep's face fell, his blustering demeanor deflating like a punctured balloon. While the legal battle of words unfolded, Master Sergeant Chun was conducting his own quiet, methodical work. He moved around the room with the silent efficiency of a seasoned investigator, taking photographs of Maya's wrists from multiple angles. He requested and received copies of all the mall security footage, not just from the store, but from the entire perimeter. He took sworn statements from the two mall security guards, who were now terrified and tripping over themselves to cooperate. The younger guard, his face pale, admitted that they were often informally encouraged by management to pay extra attention to certain kinds of shoppers. Chen's demeanor was polite, almost serene, but his questions were like surgical instruments, precise and penetrating. He asked Officer Miller for his badge number, his years of service, and the number of excessive force complaints filed against him in the last 5 years. Miller refused to answer. No matter, Chun said calmly, tapping on a ruggedized tablet he carried. We can access that through official channels. The atmosphere in the room grew increasingly tense. The clear lines of authority had been completely redrawn. The local cop and his union rep were outmaneuvered. The mall security guards were flipping on their employer, and Susan Miller was sitting in stunned silence, the architect of the scheme now trapped in its wreckage. Evelyn had stepped back, allowing her team to operate. She stood beside Maya, who was now being attended to by the military medic Chun had brought with him. The medic gently cleaned the wounds on her wrists and applied antiseptic and bandages, his movements gentle and reassuring. You're going to be okay, he said softly to Maya. Just some superficial lacerations. But we'll need to document this properly. Maya, who had been watching the proceedings with a kind of dazed awe, finally looked up at her mother. You brought the army, she whispered. Evelyn put a protective arm around her daughter's shoulders. No, baby, she said, her voice low and fierce. I brought family. Captain Davis closed his briefcase. Mr. Rizzo, we will be in touch. In the meantime, we are escorting the Washingtons from the premises. Master Sergeant Chun will remain here to coordinate with the appropriate federal and state authorities who are already on their way. As for your client, he added, giving Officer Miller a final, dismissive look, I suggest he start thinking about his pension. The military team had taken a chaotic, unjust situation and imposed order through sheer, overwhelming competence. They had not raised their voices. They had not made threats. They had simply stated facts, cited laws, and followed procedures with an ironclad discipline that made the local authorities look like clumsy, prejudiced amateurs. The power shift was complete. Master Sergeant Chin's work had only just begun. While Captain Davis escorted a shaken Maya and a resolute Evelyn from the mall, Chun transformed the small security office into a tactical operations center. His ruggedized tablet was his primary weapon, and with it, he began to unravel a conspiracy that was far more extensive than a simple insurance scam. Mrs. Miller, he said, his voice deceptively mild as he turned his attention to the now sobbing accuser. Susan Miller, age 42. You have an interesting history. On his tablet, he brought up a file compiled with astonishing speed by military intelligence analysts at Fort Bragg. According to this, you filed 6 similar stolen handbag claims in the last 2 years in 3 different states. Each time, the bag was a high-value, limited edition item. Each time, the insurance payout was substantial. And each time, the person you accused was a young person of color. Susan Miller's sobs intensified, but they now sounded hollow, performative. I'm just unlucky. I'm a victim. Are you? Chun continued, swiping to another screen. Let's talk about the man you met at the coffee shop. His name is Mark Bishop. He's a former loss prevention officer with a criminal record for fraud and possession of stolen goods. Our facial recognition software picked him up from the security footage and cross-referenced it with federal databases. He's a known associate of a multi-state retail crime syndicate. He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. This wasn't just about insurance fraud. Was it, Mrs. Miller? This was a diversion. Your role was to create a scene, to draw all attention, security, staff, other shoppers, to an innocent target. While everyone was focused on the public humiliation of a teenage girl, Mr. Bishop's associates were free to operate elsewhere in the mall, boosting high-end electronics and jewelry without being noticed. The accusation against Maya wasn't just the goal, it was the cover. The complexity and cold-blooded nature of the scheme stunned everyone remaining in the room. They hadn't just framed an innocent girl. They had used her, exploited the very racial biases of society as a tool for their criminal enterprise. They had counted on the clerk, the guards, and Officer Miller to react exactly as they had, with immediate, unthinking prejudice. Maya was not just a target, she was a tactic. That's not true. Susan stammered, but her denial was weak, pathetic. Chun ignored her and made a call. This is Master Sergeant Chun. I'm forwarding a file on a subject named Mark Bishop and his known associates. They're likely still in the vicinity of the mall. I'm also sending license plates for 3 vehicles registered to them. Set up a perimeter. Within minutes, the mall was quietly and efficiently locked down by a combination of local police, now under the direct command of a much more serious and professional captain who had arrived on scene, and plainclothes military personnel who had been part of Evelyn's quiet support team. Chun then turned his attention to the store manager from Stargazer's Gear, who was trying to make himself as small as possible in a corner of the room. Sir, we'll need your store's complete transaction and inventory record for the past 24 hours. I have a warrant. The manager, sweating profusely, complied. A quick analysis by Chun and his remote team revealed that 3 high-end astronomical cameras and a GPS-enabled telescope mount, with a combined value of over $15,000, were missing from the inventory. They had been stolen during the exact window of time that all store personnel were distracted by the confrontation with Maya. The conspiracy was laid bare, a complex machine of criminality that ran on the fuel of systemic racism. Susan Miller's role was to be the respectable white woman, the damsel in distress whose word would be taken as gospel. Maya's role was to be the plausible scapegoat, the black teenager in a hoodie whose guilt would be assumed without question. It was a cynical, nihilistic worldview, and it had almost worked perfectly. The union representative, Frank Rizzo, who had been silently observing this, saw his defense of Officer Miller crumbling into dust. His client hadn't just made a procedural error. He had been a willing, predictable pawn in a major criminal operation. He had been played, and his own prejudice had made him the perfect mark. "My client was deceived," Rizzo said weakly. "He was acting on the information he was given." Chen looked up from his tablet, his gaze sharp. "Your client was given a choice, Mr. Rizzo. He could have been a police officer, or he could have been a bigot. He chose to be a bigot. And in doing so, he allowed a felony to be committed right under his nose while he was busy traumatizing a child. That's not being deceived. That's being incompetent." The truth was now undeniable, a harsh, unflattering light that exposed not just the criminals, but the system that had enabled them. The casual, everyday racism wasn't just an unfortunate social ill. It was a tactical vulnerability, a weakness that could be and had been ruthlessly exploited. The arrival of Police Chief Ramirez was like a sudden change in barometric pressure. She was a compact, no-nonsense Latina woman in her 50s, with sharp, intelligent eyes that missed nothing. She strode into the security office, took in the scene. The military personnel, the cowering union rep, the ashen-faced Officer Miller, and her expression hardened into one of controlled fury. She had been on a crusade to reform the department, to root out the very kind of old-school policing that Miller embodied. This incident was a high-profile, humiliating setback. Her first action was to walk directly over to Master Sergeant Chen. "Master Sergeant," she said, extending a hand. "Chief Ramirez, thank you for your professionalism. My department will offer its full cooperation with your investigation." Then, she turned to Officer Miller. Her voice was quiet, but it carried an edge of steel. "Officer Miller, your badge and your service weapon." "Now, Chief, Miller began, his voice cracking. "Don't," she cut him off. "You have disgraced this uniform. You are suspended without pay, effective immediately, pending a full internal and federal investigation. You have the right to remain silent. I suggest you exercise it." Miller, his face a mask of disbelief and rage, slowly unclipped his badge and unholstered his weapon, placing them on the table with trembling hands. The symbolic act of being stripped of his authority in front of military police was a profound humiliation. The consequences cascaded swiftly from there. Based on the information provided by Chun, police units located and arrested Mark Bishop and two other members of the crime syndicate in the mall's parking garage. They were caught red-handed with the stolen merchandise from Stargazer's gear and other stores, as well as Susan Miller's stolen handbag. Susan herself was read her rights and formally arrested, her performative tears replaced by a look of cold, hard fury. The CEO of the Northgate Galleria's parent company, having been alerted by his frantic legal team, called Chief Ramirez's personal cell. He was informed in no uncertain terms that his mall had been used as the staging ground for a federal crime, facilitated by his own poorly trained and biased security staff. Before the hour was out, both Henderson, the head of security, and the two guards who had initially detained Maya were fired. The manager of Stargazer's gear was also terminated by his company's corporate headquarters via a terse phone call. The company then issued a public statement, apologizing profusely to the Washington family and announcing a complete overhaul of their loss prevention and customer service training programs nationwide. But the most significant fallout was happening online. A shopper who had witnessed Maya's humiliating walk to the security office had filmed the entire thing on their phone. The video, showing a calm, dignified young girl in handcuffs being marched past gawking onlookers, had been posted to social media with the caption, "This is what happens when you're a black girl in a hoodie at the Northgate Galleria." It exploded. Within an hour, the hashtag Justice for Maya was trending nationally. The video was viewed millions of times. Local and national news outlets picked up the story, and reporters began descending on the mall. The narrative was powerful and undeniable. A brilliant young student and daughter of a military hero had been racially profiled, assaulted, and framed. By the time Evelyn and Maya arrived home, their phones were buzzing incessantly with calls and messages of support from friends, family, and fellow military families who had seen the story break. Evelyn, ever the strategist, knew this was a critical moment. They could either retreat from the spotlight or lean into it. She looked at Maya, who was sitting silently on the sofa, the bandages on her wrists a stark white against her skin. "Maya," she said gently, "we have a choice to make. This is about to get very big. We can let them tell our story, or we can tell it ourselves." Maya looked at the video on her phone, at the face of the girl in the footage, a stranger, yet intimately herself. She saw the shame and fear in her eyes, but also a flicker of the defiance she had felt. She thought of all the other kids who looked like her, who might not have a Green Beret for a mother to call. "We tell it," Maya said, her voice quiet but firm. "We tell all of it." The decision was made. This would not be a story that was swept under the rug with a quiet settlement. This would be a reckoning. The fallout was just beginning, and the Washingtons were about to turn the full, glaring light of public scrutiny onto the dark corners of a system that had failed them. The glare of the media spotlight was relentless, but the quiet aftermath, in the sanctuary of their own home, was where the true cost of the day's events became apparent. The adrenaline faded, leaving behind a deep, bone-weary exhaustion and the insidious tendrils of trauma. Maya, who had faced down police officers and accusers with such stoic composure, found herself trembling uncontrollably in the silence of her own room. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the faces in the mall, their expressions a mixture of pity and contempt. She could feel the phantom grip of the guards on her arms, the biting cold of the handcuffs on her wrists. The world, which had once felt like a place of infinite possibility and discovery, now seemed fraught with invisible threats. A car driving slowly down their street, the ring of the doorbell, everything was a potential danger. Evelyn watched her daughter with a heavy heart, recognizing the symptoms of trauma with the practiced eye of a soldier. She had seen it in young privates after their first firefight, the hypervigilance, the emotional numbness punctuated by waves of anxiety. She knew that the wounds you couldn't see were often the ones that cut the deepest. She set aside the role of sergeant major and fully embraced the role of mom. She made Maya her favorite meal, macaroni and cheese from scratch, and they ate in comfortable silence. She didn't push her to talk. Instead, she sat with her, a quiet, unwavering presence that communicated safety and unconditional love. Later that evening, as they sat on the back porch watching the stars begin to appear in the twilight sky, Maya finally spoke. "I did everything you taught me," she whispered, her voice thick with unshed tears. "I stayed calm. I was respectful. I stated the facts. And they didn't see me. They just saw a threat." Evelyn put her arm around her daughter, pulling her close. "I know, baby. I know." She took a deep breath, the words she had to say tasting like ash in her mouth. "I spent my whole career fighting enemies overseas, believing I was making this country safer. But I failed to prepare you for the battles you have to fight right here. The truth is, sometimes the uniform, the rank, the medals, they don't protect us from this. Sometimes they make the target on our backs even bigger." She shared stories Maya had never heard before, of quiet slights from fellow soldiers, of being passed over for promotion she had earned, of the constant, grinding pressure to be twice as good, to be considered half as equal. She didn't do it to diminish Maya's pain, but to build a bridge to it, to show her she was not alone in her struggle. "This pain you're feeling," Evelyn said, her voice low and fierce, "it's real. Don't ever let anyone tell you it's not. But you can't let it define you. You have to let it fuel you." The healing process was slow, and it came from unexpected quarters. The next day, members of Maya's astronomy club showed up at their house. They didn't talk about the incident at the mall. Instead, they brought a new, high-powered eyepiece for her telescope and a star chart marking the optimal viewing times for the Andromeda Galaxy that week. It was their way of saying, "We still see you. We see the astronomer." Her mentor, a renowned astrophysicist at the local university with whom Maya had been corresponding, released a public statement. "Maya Washington is one of the brightest, most promising young scientific minds I have ever encountered," he wrote. That her intellectual curiosity was met with suspicion and violence is an indictment of a society that too often fears the brilliance of its black children. The messages of support poured in, creating a digital shield against the ugliness. But the true healing began when Maya started to reclaim her own narrative. She agreed to an interview with a respected national journalist, and with her mother by her side, she told her story. She didn't speak with anger, but with a startling, scientific clarity. She broke down the events of the day like a complex equation, explaining the systemic variables, implicit bias, racial profiling, abuse of authority that had led to the predetermined result. She spoke of her love for the cosmos, for a universe that operated on principles of elegance and truth, and contrasted it with the messy, prejudiced world she was forced to navigate. When you look through a telescope, she said, her voice gaining strength, you realize how small and interconnected we all are. There are no borders or biases in space. The light from a distant star travels for millions of years to reach us. It doesn't care what we look like. I wish we could learn from that. The interview was powerful, and it resonated deeply with millions of people. In speaking her truth, in refusing to be just a silent victim, Maya began to transmute her trauma into a powerful tool for change. The healing was far from over, but in that act of reclaiming her voice, she had taken the first, crucial step from the darkness back into the light. The interview was a declaration of intent. The Washingtons were not going away. They were not accepting a quiet settlement. They were fighting back, and their fight was not just for Maya, but for everyone who had ever been silenced or sidelined by a prejudice system. Evelyn, leveraging her 2 decades of military strategic planning, coordinated the campaign with the precision of a special operation. She and Maya, in consultation with Captain Davis and a high-powered civil rights attorney who had taken their case pro bono, decided on a multi-front assault. The first front was legal. They filed a sweeping civil rights lawsuit not only against Susan Miller and her criminal associates, but against the Northgate Galleria's parent company, Stargazer's Gear, and the city's police department. The suit didn't just seek damages, it demanded systemic, court-supervised reforms. It cited a pattern of discriminatory practices, using the data Master Sergeant Chun had compiled, including sworn affidavits from other victims of profiling at the same mall. The second front was legislative. Evelyn Washington was a formidable presence. In her full dress uniform, adorned with medals for valor and service, she testified before a congressional subcommittee on military family affairs. She spoke not as a victim, but as a soldier and a mother. "My daughter is the child of a Green Beret," she stated, her voice ringing with authority. "She has endured my deployments, moved across the country, and supported my service with a quiet strength that is the hallmark of military children." Her reward for this service was to be racially profiled, physically assaulted, and framed for a crime she did not commit. If this can happen to the daughter of a sergeant major, what is happening to the families of our junior enlisted soldiers? This is not just a civil rights issue. It is a military readiness issue. Her testimony was a bombshell. It reframed the narrative, connecting the dots between domestic discrimination and national security. The committee, moved and slightly intimidated, immediately began drafting new legislation aimed at providing stronger federal protections for military families facing discrimination. The third, and perhaps most powerful, front was driven by Maya herself. She refused to let the incident define her as a victim. Instead, she channeled her anger and her analytical mind into action. She started working with a local youth advocacy group, and with the help of some friends from her coding club, she began developing a mobile application. The app, which she named Starlight Justice, was a tool for people to safely and anonymously report incidents of discrimination and profiling. It used geolocation to identify hotspots, collected data for analysis, and provided users with information about their rights and resources for legal aid. It was a brilliant fusion of her passion for technology and her newfound commitment to social justice. "Data is power," she explained in a blog post announcing the project. For too long, These incidents have been dismissed as isolated or anecdotal. We're going to build a data set they can't ignore. We're going to map the injustice. The fight was grueling. The police union launched a smear campaign against them, leaking misleading details of Officer Miller's service record. Pro-police pundits on cable news painted Maya as an anti-cop activist. But for every attack, their coalition of support grew stronger. Veterans groups rallied around Evelyn. Tech companies offered pro bono support for Maya's app. Civil rights organizations amplified their message. They were no longer just a mother and daughter fighting a personal battle. They had become the center of a movement. They were forcing a conversation that many in power did not want to have about the ugly intersection of race, class, and justice in America. One evening, exhausted after a long day of legal depositions and coding sessions, Maya found her mother looking at an old photograph on the mantelpiece. It was of Evelyn's father, Maya's grandfather, in his army uniform from the Vietnam era. He fought in a segregated army, Evelyn said quietly. He believed he was fighting for freedoms he wasn't even allowed to have back home. He used to tell me, the fight for justice is a relay, not a sprint. You take the baton, you run your leg as hard as you can, and then you pass it on. I guess, she said, turning to Maya with a look of immense pride. It's your turn to run. Maya looked at the app's code on her laptop screen, at the lines of logic and data that she hoped would build a more just world. She felt the weight of the baton in her hand. It was heavy, but she was ready to run. The trial was the culmination of months of relentless preparation, and the courtroom buzzed with an energy that was part legal drama, part cultural event. National media filled the press gallery. Supporters of the Washingtons, wearing shirts with the hashtag #JusticeForMaya hashtag, packed one side of the room, while a smaller, grim-faced contingent of police officers and their families sat on the other. The defense strategy was clear from the outset. Attack the victims. The legal team for the police department and the mall tried to paint a picture of a coordinated, opportunistic shakedown. They portrayed Evelyn as an intimidating, high-ranking soldier improperly using her influence, and Maya as a troubled, resentful teenager with a chip on her shoulder. Their first mistake was putting Maya on the stand. Under the harsh glare of the courtroom lights, Maya Washington was not the angry activist they tried to depict. She was poised, articulate, and unshakably precise. The defense attorney, a slick, aggressive man named Peterson, began by questioning her presence at the mall. Miss Washington, you were in a store filled with very expensive equipment. Equipment, I might add, that would be far beyond the budget of a typical teenager, he insinuated. Maya met his gaze without blinking. Sir, I wasn't there to browse. I was there to purchase a NEMA 17-stepper motor and an Arduino Uno microcontroller with a budget of $65 that I had saved from my part-time job tutor in calculus. Would you like me to explain the principles of astrophotographic tracking and why those specific components were necessary for my project? The lawyer, flustered by her technical specificity, quickly changed tactics. You claim Officer Miller's handcuffs injured you. Isn't it possible you were resisting arrest? I did not resist, Maya stated calmly. I complied with all instructions, despite being terrified. The injuries were a result of the cuffs being applied with punitive force. The military medic who first treated me, as well as the emergency room physician, both documented the lacerations as being inconsistent with standard restraint procedures. Their sworn testimonies are in evidence. Peterson tried to twist her composure into something sinister. You seem very calm, very rehearsed, almost as if you've been coached. Maya's response was devastating in its quiet sincerity. Sir, my mother has been teaching me how to survive interactions like this since I was 10 years old. It's a curriculum she calls Living While Black. The lessons include, keep your hands visible, do not make sudden movements, speak respectfully, and control your emotions because your fear can be interpreted as aggression. So, yes, you could say I've been coached. Not for a courtroom, but for survival. A hush fell over the courtroom. The jury was captivated. Peterson, seeing his strategy backfire spectacularly, had no further questions. When Evelyn took the stand, the defense tried a different approach. attempting to frame her as an overbearing military officer pulling rank. "Sergeant Major, isn't it true you use your position to intimidate a local police officer?" Evelyn's posture was ramrod straight, but her voice was filled with a mother's pain. "I served for 20 years. I have led soldiers in combat. I have faced enemy fire. And I can tell you, without any hesitation, that the most terrifying moment of my entire life was hearing my child's voice on the phone, telling me she was in handcuffs and bleeding. I didn't present myself as a soldier until your client and his colleagues mocked the very idea of it. I arrived as a mother. They're the ones who made my rank an issue." The prosecution's case was a methodical, overwhelming presentation of evidence. They played the complete, unedited security footage. They brought in Master Sergeant Shun, who calmly and clinically detailed the criminal conspiracy and how Officer Miller's biased actions had enabled it. They put other victims of Susan Miller's scam on the stand, who told stories hauntingly similar to Maya's. The showdown reached its climax during closing arguments. The defense lawyer painted a picture of a dangerous world where police officers had to make split-second decisions. But the civil rights attorney for the Washingtons stood before the jury and told a different story. "The defense wants you to believe this was a mistake, a misunderstanding," she said, her voice ringing with passion. But this was not a mistake. It was a choice. Officer Miller chose to believe the lie of a practice con artist over the truth of an innocent child. Why? Because one fit his prejudice and the other did not. This case is not about one officer or one incident. It is about whether we, as a society, will continue to accept a system where the color of a child's skin makes him a suspect. It's about whether the promise of justice for all is a reality or just words we say. As she finished, she walked over and stood behind Maya. "Look at this young woman. They tried to make her a statistic, but they failed. They fail because she is brilliant. They fail because she is brave. And they fail because she is her mother's daughter." The jury filed out. The wait for the verdict was agonizing. But in her heart, Maya knew they had done everything they could. They had spoken their truth. Now, it was up to the system to decide if it was ready to listen. The jury was out for less than 3 hours. When they filed back into the courtroom, their faces were solemn, resolute. Maya's heart pounded against her ribs. She felt her mother's hand find hers under the table, a firm, steadying presence. The foreman, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes, stood and unfolded a piece of paper. "On the matter of the civil suit of Washington versus the city police department, we the jury find in favor of the plaintiff." A wave of relief and emotion washed over Maya. Tears she had held back for months finally streamed down her face. The foreman continued, her voice clear and strong. "We find that Officer James Miller acted with reckless disregard for Maya Washington's civil rights and engaged in the use of excessive force. We find that the Northgate Galleria and its tenant, Stargazer's Gear, fostered an environment of discriminatory security practices. We award the plaintiff compensatory and punitive damages. But the victory was far more significant than a monetary sum. The judge, an older black woman who had presided over the trial with stern impartiality, then read her binding orders, which would have repercussions far beyond this single case. The police department was placed under a federal consent decree mandating sweeping reforms. This included a complete overhaul of their use of force policies, mandatory, ongoing implicit bias training developed in consultation with civil rights groups, and the creation of a civilian oversight board with the power to investigate and discipline officers. Officer Miller was fired from the force, stripped of his pension, and faced separate federal charges for perjury and civil rights violations. The Northgate Galleria's parent company was ordered to implement a new, transparent security protocol, which would be audited by an independent firm for the next 5 years. And, in a move that brought a fresh wave of tears to Maya's eyes, the judge ordered the company to establish and endow a multi-million-dollar STEM scholarship fund for minority students. It was to be called the Maya Washington Interstellar Scholars Program. The news of the verdict rippled across the country. It was a landmark decision, one of the first to successfully hold not just an individual officer, but an entire department and a major corporation accountable for the systemic nature of racial profiling. The legislative impact was just as profound. Spurred by Evelyn's testimony and the immense public pressure from the trial, Congress passed a bipartisan bill. It was unofficially, but universally, known as the Maya Act. It strengthened legal protections for military families facing discrimination and allocated federal funding to police departments for the specific purpose of implementing anti-bias training and community outreach programs. For Maya, the most meaningful victory was not the money or the fame, but the tangible change she saw in the world around her. Her app, Starlight Justice, received funding from a major tech philanthropist and was launched nationwide. It became a powerful tool, a way for communities to hold institutions accountable through the undeniable power of data. She was accepted with a full scholarship to her dream school, MIT. Her ordeal had not derailed her ambition. It had deepened it. She now understood that science was not just about understanding the universe, but also about improving the world. She wanted to build systems, not just with code, but with policy and advocacy, that were as elegant, fair, and logical as the physical laws that govern the cosmos. 1 year after the trial, Maya stood on a stage at the first ever Interstellar Scholars Gala, held, poetically, in the central atrium of the Northgate Galleria. The mall was transformed, its security guards now retrained and looking more like community ambassadors than enforcers. She was there to award the first 10 scholarships to a group of brilliant, hopeful young students of color who, like her, dreamed of the stars. A year ago, in this very building, I was made to feel small, she told the assembled crowd. I was treated like a suspect because of the color of my skin. But what our victory proved is that no one has the power to define you but you. They tried to put me in a box, but my dreams were always in the stars. This scholarship is for all the kids who have been told, in ways big and small, that they don't belong. We are here to tell you that you belong everywhere. The universe is yours to discover. Her mother, now a consultant for the Department of Defense on civil-military relations, watched from the front row, her face a mixture of pride, love, and fierce satisfaction. The baton had been passed. The relay was continuing. And the future, Maya had proven, was indeed interstellar. 2 years later, the air is crisp and cool on the rooftop of the Wallace Astrophysical Observatory at MIT. The massive dome is open to the night sky, a breathtaking tapestry of stars glittering against the infinite black. Maya Washington, now a confident 19-year-old sophomore, makes a final adjustment to the primary mirror of the observatory's main telescope. Her mother stands beside her, wrapped in a warm coat. Evelyn is visiting for the weekend, a rare break from her work in Washington, D.C. They stand in comfortable silence for a moment, two figures silhouetted against the cosmos. "Find what you were looking for?" Evelyn asks softly. Maya smiles, her eyes still fixed on the eyepiece. "Always. Tonight, it's a variable star in the Triangulum Galaxy. It's a bit of a paradox. The more we learn, the more we realize how much we don't know." Her words hang in the cool night air, a perfect metaphor for their journey. The legal victory had been decisive, but the larger fight against prejudice was ongoing. The Maya Act had been passed, but its implementation was a slow, grinding process. The scholarship was changing lives, but it couldn't erase the systemic inequalities that made it necessary in the first place. News segments occasionally flashed back to their story. They showed Officer Miller, convicted on federal charges, offering a reluctant, court-mandated apology. They showed Susan Miller, serving a sentence for her role in the criminal syndicate, her life of privilege replaced by the harsh reality of consequence. They showed the ongoing, positive changes in police departments and corporate policies across the country, a ripple effect of the stone they had thrown into the pond. But the most profound change was quieter, harder to measure. It was in the conversations people were having, in the heightened awareness, in the small acts of courage inspired by their story. The world hadn't been magically fixed, but it had been nudged, shifted on its axis just a little. Evelyn looks at her daughter, no longer a child forced to be brave, but a young woman choosing her own path. Maya's passion for the universe is infectious. Her determination to use her intellect for good, absolute. The trauma of that day at the mall is no longer an open wound, but a scar, a reminder of a battle fought and won, a source of strength and empathy. You know, Evelyn says, her voice filled with a quiet pride that is as vast as the sky above them. Your grandfather would have been so proud of you. Not just for this, she gestures to the massive telescope, but for everything, for not being afraid of the darkness. Maya turns from the eyepiece, her eyes shining with reflected starlight. How could I be, she says, when I know that's where you find the light? What would you have done in Maya's situation? Have you ever faced a moment where you had to stand up for what's right, even when it was terrifying? Share your story in the comments below, and let's show respect for everyone's experience. If this story reminds you that one person's courage can spark a universe of change, hit that like button, subscribe for more stories of justice, and share this video with someone who needs to see that the truth is a force of nature. Comment respect to show your support for victims of injustice everywhere.